The great council chamber on Zenith Prime Station hummed with the voices of 100 different species. The massive circular room stretched 3 stories high, with viewing galleries for observers and press stations for the galactic media. Representatives from across known space sat in their designated sections, some breathing oxygen, others methane, each in their environmental pods designed for their specific needs. Ambassador Daniel Hayes stood at the human podium, his hands gripping the edges of the metallic surface. He was a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many arguments, too many dismissals, too many votes where human concerns were simply brushed aside. Behind him sat the rest of the human delegation, 12 men and women who had spent years trying to make the other species understand that the smaller civilizations mattered too. The chamber fell silent as Daniel activated his microphone. His voice carried across the vast space, translated instantly into hundreds of languages by the station's systems. He had practiced this speech many times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavy on his tongue. "Members of the Galactic Council," he began, "I stand before you today to announce that humanity is withdrawing from Council membership. Effective immediately, all human diplomatic staff will leave Council space. Our military vessels will return to human territory. Our trade agreements will be honored until their expiration dates, but we will not be renewing them. Humanity thanks the Council for the opportunity to participate in galactic affairs, but we can no longer in good conscience support the direction this body has taken." The chamber erupted. The Crothans, massive beings covered in thick armor plating, roared their approval. They had never liked the humans anyway, always getting in the way of proper military expansion. The Viridians, tall and thin with silver skin and calculating eyes, remained silent, but their satisfaction was obvious in the way they glanced at each other. The Solarians, proud, bird-like creatures with brilliant plumage, rustled their feathers in what could only be interpreted as relief. Director Zephyron, Viridian who led the council, called for order. His voice was cold and precise. "Ambassador Hayes, this is an unprecedented action. Are you certain humanity wishes to take this step? There will be consequences for leaving the council." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "We are certain. Humanity has tried for 30 years to convince this council that protecting developing civilizations is not just morally right, but strategically necessary. We have argued that exploitation of weaker species creates instability. We have warned that allowing the strong to simply take what they want will lead to conflict. But our warnings have fallen on deaf ears. We are done talking to people who will not listen." In the viewing galleries, representatives from the smaller species watched with growing alarm. The Quillan delegation, insectoid beings barely 2 feet tall, clutched each other in distress. The Norim, aquatic creatures in their water-filled observation tubes, pressed against the glass as if trying to reach the human ambassador. They understood what the larger species did not. Without humanity as their voice and shield, they would be completely at the mercy of the Council's major powers commander. Lisa Warren watched the proceedings from the human embassy section of Zenith Prime. She was responsible for the evacuation, and the logistics were staggering. Hundreds of human personnel spread across dozens of Council facilities, thousands of civilians living and working in Council space, and an entire fleet of military vessels that needed to withdraw in an orderly fashion. Her communicator was already flooding with messages from various departments, asking for instructions. She pulled up the evacuation schedule on her datapad. They had 2 weeks to complete the withdrawal. It would be tight, but they had planned for this possibility. The truth was, the human government had been discussing this action for months. The final decision had come after the Council voted to reduce representation for minor species in order to streamline operations. That vote had passed with 78% support. Only humans and a handful of smaller species had voted against it. On the station's commercial deck, news of the announcement spread rapidly. Alien merchants and traders gathered around public displays showing the Council chamber. Some celebrated, believing human departure would mean fewer restrictions on their business practices. Others worried about what it might mean for stability and security. Crothan merchant named Vorgoth laughed loudly in a crowded bar. "Good riddance to the humans," he declared, his voice booming across the establishment, always preaching about fairness and equality. This is space. The strong survive and the weak serve. That is the natural order. Its companions raised their drinks in agreement. But in a corner booth, a Quillan trader named Tixik sat quietly, his antennae drooping with concern. His species had signed a protection treaty with humanity 5 years ago. Human patrol vessels had kept pirate raiders away from Quellan trade routes. What would happen now that those patrols would end? Back in the council chamber, Daniel was finishing his final statement. We hope that in our absence, the council will reconsider its current path. We hope you will realize that true strength comes not from domination, but from cooperation. But hope is not a strategy, and we will not sacrifice our principles waiting for changes that may never come. Humanity wishes the council well, but we must part ways. He deactivated his microphone and turned to leave. The other human delegates rose and followed him out. The chamber remained in chaos behind them, with representatives arguing loudly about what this meant and what should be done. Some called for sanctions against humanity. Others suggested good riddance. None of them seemed to fully grasp what was about to happen. Director Zephron watched the humans. They depart with a mixture of relief and calculation. With humanity gone, the council could finally implement the reforms that the major powers had been pushing for years. They could expand their territories into regions that humans had insisted should remain neutral. They could establish more efficient trade routes that happened to run through the space of civilizations too weak to object. They could streamline the entire galactic government without constant human objections and delays. He called for an emergency session to be held the following day. They would need to reorganize council structure, reallocate resources, and establish new protocols now that humanity was no longer a factor. It would be a busy few weeks, but ultimately, he believed the council would emerge stronger and more efficient commander. Lisa Warren stood at the viewport of the human embassy. Watching the first transport ships undocked from Zenith Prime, they carried diplomats, support staff, and their families back toward human space. More ships would follow every day until everyone was home. She felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that they were finally leaving a place where they were not valued. Sadness that it had come to this, and worry about what would happen to the smaller species they were leaving behind. Her second in command, Lieutenant Jake Peterson, approached with another status update. The military withdrawal is proceeding on schedule, he reported. Admiral Collins has ordered all defensive platforms in neutral zones to be deactivated within 48 hours. The early warning network will shut down in stages over the next week. Lisa nodded, though the mention of the early warning network troubled her. That system had prevented countless disasters over the years, but the council had never seemed to notice or care. Perhaps they would appreciate it once it was gone. Or perhaps they would never realize it had existed at all. As the last human delegate left Zenith Prime Station, a new chapter was beginning. The galaxy was about to discover exactly how much humanity had been doing behind the scenes. And the lesson would be harsh. 3 months had passed since humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council. At first, everything had seemed fine. The major powers had quickly implemented their efficiency protocols, reducing the voting power of minor species and claiming several disputed territories without opposition. Director Zephron had declared it a new golden age for the Council, where decisions could be made swiftly without endless debates about moral considerations and protection of the weak. But now, cracks were beginning to show. The first major incident occurred along the border between the Crothan Empire and the Solarian hegemony. A Crothan mining vessel had strayed 3 light-years into what the Solarians claimed was their territory. The Solarian patrol that intercepted the vessel had fired warning shots, damaging the mining ship's engines. The Crothans claimed the territory was actually disputed space and demanded compensation. The Solarians refused, insisting their territorial claims were legitimate and the Crothans should apologize for the intrusion. In the past, human mediators would have stepped in immediately. Ambassador Daniel Hayes had personally resolved for similar disputes between these two species over the years. He had a talent for finding compromise that satisfied both sides while maintaining their honor. But Daniel was back on Earth now, and the Council's remaining diplomatic corps lacked both his skill and the trust he had. built with both species over decades of patient work. General Kraith of the Crothon military stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominator, and studied the tactical display. 15 Crothon warships faced off against 12 Solarian vessels across the disputed border. His orders from the Crothan High Command were clear. Show strength. Do not back down. Make the Solarians understand that the Crothan Empire would not be disrespected. On the Solarian side, Commander Sharath preened his golden feathers and considered his options. His people were warriors too, descended from predatory birds that had ruled their homeworld's skies. To retreat now would be seen as cowardice. The Council of Elders expected him to defend Solarian honor, but he also knew that the Crothans were not known for backing down easily. Both commanders waited for the Council to intervene, to send mediators who would help them find a face-saving solution. But the days passed, and no mediators came. The Council was too busy with its restructuring to deal with what they saw as a minor border dispute. Surely, two civilized species could work out their differences without supervision. They were wrong. The shooting started when a young Crothon pilot, nervous and inexperienced, misinterpreted a Solarian scanning beam as a targeting lock and fired. His shot missed, but it was enough. Within seconds, both fleets opened fire. The battle lasted only 6 minutes before both sides pulled back, shocked by how quickly things had escalated. 3 ships were destroyed, 2 Crothan and 1 Solarian. Hundreds of crew members died in the cold vacuum of space. The incident made the galactic news immediately. For the first time in 30 years, 2 Council species had engaged in direct military combat. Director Zephron called an emergency session, and both sides were summoned to explain themselves. But the damage was done. The Crothan Empire mobilized additional fleets. The Solarian hegemony did the same. What had started as a minor territorial dispute was rapidly becoming a potential war. Meanwhile, in a completely different region of Council space, the Viridians were dealing with an unexpected problem. They had moved to claim the Tauran system, home to a developing civilization that had only achieved spaceflight 20 years ago. The system was rich in rare minerals, and according to Council law, any species that had not achieved faster-than-light travel could not claim interstellar territory. It was a law that humanity had fought against for years, arguing that it was essentially a justification for exploitation. But humanity was gone now. The Viridians saw no reason to delay claiming such valuable resources. Fleet Captain Mevron led the Viridian task force that entered the Tauran system. He expected a simple operation. The Tauran people would be informed that their system was now under Viridian administration. In exchange for access to their planets and asteroid fields, the Tauran would receive technology and trade opportunities. It was, in Viridian thinking, a fair deal. The Tauran would certainly benefit more from Viridian guidance than from independence. But when the Viridian fleet arrived, they found that Tauran had built a defensive network around their homeworld. Dozens of weapon satellites orbited the planet armed with missiles and kinetic weapons. The technology was crude compared to Viridian standards, but there was a lot of it. And the Tauran commander who contacted Captain Mevron was not interested in negotiating. "This is our home," the Tauran declared, her 6-fingered hand gripping the arm of her command chair. "You have no right to it. Leave now, or we will defend ourselves." Captain Mevron was stunned. Where had the Tauran learned to build such weapons? His intelligence briefings had indicated they were still struggling with basic space infrastructure. He ran a detailed scan of the weapon satellites and found his answer. The designs were based on human educational materials. Humanity had provided developing species with defensive knowledge, teaching them how to protect themselves from exactly this kind of exploitation. The Viridians found themselves in an awkward position. They could easily destroy the Tauran defenses, but it would require significant military force and would result in heavy Tauran casualties. That would make them look like aggressors in the eyes of other species. But if they withdrew without claiming the system, they would appear weak. Captain Mevron contacted the Council for guidance, but Director Zephron's response was unhelpful. The Council had no policy for dealing with minor species that actually defended themselves. In the past, humanity had ensured such situations never arose. By negotiating protection agreements and development aid that satisfied all parties. Now there was no one to negotiate. The Viridians had to choose between looking aggressive or looking weak. Far outside council space, Captain Greg Martinez commanded the human survey ship Pathfinder. His mission was to explore and map systems beyond the established boundaries, looking for resources and potential colony sites for humanity's expanding population. It was routine work, usually quiet and uneventful, but his communications officer, Ensign Rachel Brooks, had picked up something unusual: distress calls. Dozens of them, coming from different minor species across what used to be human-protected trade routes. Pirates were attacking merchant vessels, raiding colony worlds, taking whatever they wanted because there was no longer anyone to stop them. Greg listened to one of the recordings, his jaw tightening as he heard the fear in the alien captain's voice. The ship was under attack, their shields failing, and they were begging for help from anyone who could hear. The message was 3 days old. By now, that ship and its crew were certainly lost. Ow. How many calls have you picked up? Greg asked. Rachel checked her display. 47 in the last week, sir. And those are just the ones our sensors can detect. There are probably hundreds more that we cannot hear. Greg wanted to help. Every instinct told him to change course, to rush to the aid of these beings who were suffering. But his orders were clear. Humanity was no longer involved in galactic affairs. They were not the galaxy's police force. They were not responsible for protecting everyone. But knowing that did not make it any easier to listen to the distress calls and do nothing. Back on Earth, in the gleaming towers of the United Earth Government headquarters, Admiral Peter Collins presented his intelligence report to a room full of concerned officials. The walls displayed maps of council space, now marked with dozens of red indicators showing conflicts, pirate activity, and territorial disputes. The situation is deteriorating faster than we predicted, Peter explained, his voice grim. The Crothan-Solarian situation could explode into full war within weeks. Minor species are being raided or exploited without protection, and the Council seems unable to handle any of it without our diplomatic corps and security infrastructure. President Catherine Moore studied the displays with a troubled expression. She had authorized the withdrawal, believing it was necessary to make the Council understand humanity's value. But she had hoped it would take longer for things to fall apart. She had hoped the other species would realize their mistake and ask humanity to return with better terms. Instead, everything was happening too fast, and people were dying. What are our options? She asked. Peter hesitated. We can maintain our withdrawal and hope the Council figures things out. Or we can offer to return, but that might make us look weak, like we were bluffing. Or, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Or we can prepare for the possibility that the galaxy is about to tear itself apart, and we need to be ready to deal with the consequences. Catherine looked at the maps again, at all those red indicators spreading like a disease across known space. She had made a difficult choice 3 months ago, believing it was right. Now, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. 6 months after humanity's withdrawal, the galaxy was burning. The Crothan-Solarian border war that had started with a single skirmish had exploded into full-scale conflict. Hundreds of ships battled across dozens of systems. Planets that had enjoyed peace for generations now watched enemy fleets clash in their skies. And worst of all, the neutral zones that humanity had carefully established and maintained. For decades were being violated constantly as both sides maneuvered for advantage. General Kraith stood in the war room of the Crothan High Command, studying holographic battle displays. His forces had won several victories, but the Solarians kept fighting with a ferocity that surprised him. He had expected them to fold after the first few defeats, but instead they seemed to grow more determined. The war was costing both empires enormous resources. There was no end in sight. What troubled him most were the reports from occupied systems. The Crothans had seized control of 3 star systems that lay between their territory and the Solarians. These systems were home to minor species, civilizations that had nothing to do with the war, but found themselves in the middle of it. Crothan military doctrine called for securing all assets in occupied territory, which meant forcing the local populations to provide resources and labor for the war effort. The reports spoke of refugee streams, populations fleeing their homes to escape the fighting. They spoke of factories being converted to produce weapons, of food supplies being requisitioned, of local governments being dissolved and replaced with military administration. General Kraith told himself this was necessary for victory, but late at night. He sometimes wondered what Ambassador Daniel Hayes would have said about these actions. On the Solarian side, Commander Sharath faced similar problems. His people had also occupied neutral systems, and the local populations were suffering. But worse than that, the Solarian economy was strainy. Under the cost of the war. Trade routes that had been safe for decades were now dangerous, forcing merchants to take longer paths or risk attack. Goods were not reaching their destinations. Prices were rising, and the Solarian people were beginning to question whether this war was worth the cost. Director Zephron called another emergency council session, the fifth since the war began. He stood at his podium and looked out at the assembled representatives with growing desperation. The council was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. They were supposed to mediate disputes and maintain peace. But every attempt at negotiation had failed. The problem was simple. No one trusted anyone else. The Crothans did not trust the Viridian mediators because they suspected the Viridians wanted them weakened. The Solarians did not trust anyone who had not explicitly condemned the Crothan aggression. The smaller species, whose territories were being devastated by the fighting, had no voice loud enough to be heard. Zephron found himself wishing, not for the first time, that Ambassador Hayes was still here. The human had possessed an almost supernatural ability to get hostile parties to actually listen to each other. He had built personal relationships with leaders across the galaxy, relationships based on years of trust and mutual respect. The current Viridian diplomatic corps had training and intelligence, but they lacked whatever indefinable quality had made the humans so effective. While the Crothan-Solarian War consumed everyone's attention, the security situation across the rest of Council space continued to deteriorate. Captain Victor Dunn commanded the pirate vessel Night Runner, and business had never been better. For years, human patrol vessels had made piracy a dangerous and unprofitable career. The humans had maintained a network of security stations and rapid response fleets that could arrive at any attacked ship within hours. But those stations were shut down now. The patrol fleets were gone. And the Council's major powers were too busy fighting each other or securing their own territories to care about protecting trade routes. Victor's crew had taken 15 ships in the last 2 months alone. Merchant vessels, colony transports, even a few scientific research ships. The cargoes were valuable, but more than that, there was no risk. No human destroyers would suddenly appear to hunt them down. No diplomatic pressure would be applied to whatever government might be harboring them. The galaxy had become a pirate's paradise. But Victor was starting to notice something troubling. The ships they attacked were getting more desperate. Crews were fighting back harder, knowing that no help was coming. Some ships were traveling armed now, their captains preferring to risk weapons charges rather than be helpless victims. The galaxy was becoming more violent, more fearful, more savage. On the human colony world of New Terra, Lieutenant Amy Foster monitored the communications networks from her station in the Planetary Defense Center. Her job was to track potential threats to human space, but she found herself listening to broadcasts from across the galaxy. Distress calls from ships under attack. News reports about the spreading war. Diplomatic channels filled with accusations and threats instead of cooperation. She compiled reports for Admiral Collins, documenting the collapse of galactic order. The numbers were staggering. Pirate attacks had increased by 400%. Trade volumes had dropped by 60% as merchants avoided dangerous routes. 14 minor species had filed formal complaints about exploitation or occupation, complaints that the Council had not acted on. And an estimated 2 million beings had died in the war or related violence. Amy had joined the military because she believed in protecting people. Watching the galaxy tear itself apart while humanity did nothing felt wrong. Even though she understood the political reasons for the withdrawal, she wondered how many of her fellow officers felt the same way. The Viridian Collective was discovering that claiming territory was easier than holding it. After the incident with the Tauran, they had successfully seized 3 other developing systems. But each conquest required military forces to maintain control, and the occupied populations were not cooperative. Sabotage was common. Resistance movements were forming, and the Viridians were learning the hard way that ruling unwilling subjects was expensive and difficult. Captain Mevrin, who had led the failed attempt to take the Tauran system, now commanded occupation forces in the Halak system. The Halak people were reptilian beings who had achieved spaceflight, but not faster than light travel. By council law, the Viridians had every right to administer the system. But the Halak did not see it that way. Every day brought new problems. Workers refusing to report to the mining facilities. Computer systems mysteriously malfunctioning. Supply shipments disappearing. The Halak were not fighting with weapons, but they were fighting nonetheless. And Captain Mevron was beginning to understand why humanity had always argued against this kind of exploitation. The resentment and resistance were costing the Viridians more than the system's resources were worth. In the Quellan home system, the tiny insectoid species that had once been protected by human treaty watched their civilization crumble. Without human patrols, the pirate raids had become constant. The Quellan had no military to speak of. Their society was built around trade and craftsmanship, not warfare. They had trusted that the galactic community would protect them. Elder Tixik, who had met Ambassador Hayes many times over the years, called a meeting of the Quellan Council. The chamber was small, built to the scale of beings who stood no taller than a human child. But the fear in the room was enormous. "Cannot survive this," one counselor said, his antennae drooping. 3 more ships were taken yesterday. Our trade partners refused to send vessels to our system. Our economy is dying. Tixik thought of the last conversation he had with Ambassador Hayes, just before the humans withdrew. The ambassador had been apologetic, explaining that humanity could not protect species who were not part of a reformed council. He had promised that if things went badly, humanity would remember its friends. But 6 months had passed, and no help had come. Back on Earth, President Catherine Moore convened her Security Council for an emergency meeting. The intelligence reports from Admiral Collins painted a dire picture. The galaxy was not just unstable, it was in freefall, collapsing into chaos faster than anyone had predicted. "How did we not see this coming?" she asked, though she knew the answer. They had seen it coming. They had just not realized how quickly it would happen or how bad it would get. Admiral Collins pulled up a particular report, one that had troubled him deeply. This is from Scholar Dravix, a Solarian researcher. He somehow gained access to our old facilities on Zenith Prime Station. He has been investigating what humanity actually did during our time on the Council. The display showed lists. Pages and pages of programs, initiatives, security operations, and diplomatic efforts. Things that humanity had done quietly, without fanfare or recognition. Educational programs for developing species. Medical aid networks. Early warning systems for natural disasters. Intelligence sharing to prevent conflicts. Communications infrastructure connecting remote civilizations. The other species never knew, Catherine said softly, staring at the lists. They never realized how much we were doing. They do now, Peter replied. Dravix has been sending me reports. Everything is falling apart because the systems we maintained are no longer functioning. And he is asking, begging really, for us to come back. Catherine looked at her advisors. We need to make a decision. Do we maintain the withdrawal and let the galaxy learn its lesson the hard way? Or do we go back? The room fell silent. Everyone knew that whatever they decided in the next few hours would determine the fate of billions of beings across known space. Scholar Dravix had never been particularly interested in humans during their time on the Council. He was a Solarian scientist, focused on his research into faster-than-light communications. The political affairs of the Council had seemed far removed from his laboratory work, but everything had changed when his nephew died in the war with the Crothans. Killed when his ship was destroyed in a battle over a meaningless chunk of rock, the grief had driven Dravix to understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. The Council had functioned, more or less, for centuries. Why had everything fallen apart in just 6 months? He began investigating, using his security clearance to access old Council records. and what he found shocked him to his core. The abandoned human facilities on Zenith Prime Station were still there, sealed but not destroyed. Dravix managed to gain access to one of the smaller offices, a place where human administrators had worked. The computers were still functional, their data intact, and as Dravix began reading through files, he realized he was looking at something the rest of the galaxy had never seen. The humans had maintained thousands of programs, educational initiatives teaching advanced technology to developing species, but carefully designed to prevent the technology from being weaponized. Medical aid networks spanning hundreds of worlds, providing vaccines and treatments for diseases that would have killed millions. Intelligence sharing systems that had prevented dozens of conflicts by alerting species to misunderstandings before they escalated into violence. But the most impressive discovery was something called the Silent Shield. Dravix found detailed records of a massive early warning network that humans had deployed throughout Council space. Thousands of sensor stations, hidden in asteroid fields and nebulae. Automated defensive platforms designed to intercept threats. A communications network that linked everything together and routed information to human response teams. The records showed what the system had done over 30 years. It had detected and deflected 17 rogue asteroids that would have struck inhabited worlds. It had identified and quarantined 3 plague ships carrying deadly viruses before they reached populated systems. It had intercepted malfunctioning AI vessels that had gone berserk and were attacking anything they encountered. It had even detected and destroyed 4 small invasion fleets from unknown civilizations in dark space, preventing attacks that no one had ever known were coming. On average, the Silent Shield had prevented 17 major catastrophes per year. No one except the humans had known it existed. Dravix stared at the data, his feathers ruffling in agitation. How had the entire galaxy failed to notice? But as he thought about it, he understood. The humans had been so efficient, so quiet about their work, that their success had been invisible. People only notice security when it fails, not when it succeeds. He immediately sent an encrypted message to Admiral Peter Collins on Earth, including all the data he had found. The message was simple. The galaxy needed humanity. They had been wrong to take humans for granted. Please, would humanity consider returning? Captain Kyle Barnes was leading a human science vessel on a routine survey mission when he received Dravix's message. The encrypted transmission came through on a channel that only a few people in the galaxy knew existed. Backup communications network that humans had established for emergencies. Kyle read the message 3 times, barely believing what he was seeing. The data Dravix had attached was extensive. Charts showing the increase in catastrophic events since the Silent Shield went offline. Ports of systems that were now vulnerable to threats they did not even know existed. Analysis showing that, without human intervention, the galactic death rate had increased by 32% in just 6 months. Kyle forwarded the data to Earth immediately, along with his own observations. His ship had been picking up sensor readings that troubled him. Several of the Silent Shield stations were still operational, running on automatic, but they were failing. Without maintenance, the systems were breaking down. The threats they had been designed to stop were still out there. Now with nothing to intercept them. On Earth, the government received Dravix's data and began a comprehensive analysis. What they discovered alarmed them. The other species had not just underestimated humanity's diplomatic contributions. They had been completely unaware of the vast infrastructure that humanity had built and maintained to keep the galaxy safe. Commander Ryan Hughes, decorated veteran who had spent 10 years managing part of the Silent Shield network, was called to brief the president. He stood in the Situation Room, surrounded by displays showing the network's current status, and explained what would happen if it failed completely. The Silent Shield was designed to handle threats that occur regularly but unpredictably, he said. Rogue asteroids, plague outbreaks, malfunctioning vessels, things like that. Without it, we estimate that within a year, at least 5 inhabited worlds will suffer extinction-level impacts. Another dozen will face plague outbreaks that could kill billions. And that is not counting the threats from dark space civilizations. President Moore listened carefully. Why did we keep all of this secret? Why not tell the council what we were doing? Ryan smiled sadly. We tried, at first, but the other species either did not believe the threats were real, or they assumed they could handle them without our help. After a while, it seemed easier to just do the work quietly, rather than argue about it. Ambassador. Hayes always said that humanity should not protect people for gratitude, but because it was the right thing to do. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed that humanity had spent decades and enormous resources protecting species who had not even known they needed protecting. And when those species had dismissed humanity as annoying idealists, the humans had simply left rather than begged to be appreciated. Director Zephron received a copy of Dravix's findings from the Solarian government. He read the report in his office, alone, and felt something he had rarely experienced in his long career. Shame. The Viridians prided themselves on their intelligence and their ability to see patterns others missed. But they had completely failed to understand what the humans were doing. He thought back to all the times he had dismissed human concerns as naive or impractical, remembered voting for policies that the humans had warned would cause instability, confident that his own judgment was superior. He remembered the relief he had felt when the humans withdrew, believing that the council would finally be able to operate efficiently. He had been a fool. They'd all been fools. Zephron called an emergency session of the council, but this time it would be different. He would present Dravix's findings to everyone. He would admit that the council had made a terrible mistake, and he would formally request that humanity return. Not as subordinate members, but as equals, with the power and respect they deserved. The council chamber filled with representatives from across the galaxy. The mood was somber. Everyone had heard rumors about what Dravix had discovered, and many had begun their own investigations, finding evidence of human programs they had never noticed before. When Zephron presented the findings, the chamber erupted not in argument, but in shocked silence. The display showed everything: the silent shield network, the educational programs, the medical aid, the diplomatic efforts that had prevented countless conflicts, the infrastructure that had kept the galaxy connected and stable. A Crothon general, one of those who had celebrated humanity's departure, stood and spoke with uncharacteristic humility. I have reviewed the data. During the 3 decades of human council membership, border conflicts between major powers occurred on average once every 4 years, and none escalated to war. In the 6 months since their departure, we have had 8 serious incidents and 1 full-scale war. The correlation is undeniable. A Viridian economist added her analysis. The human-maintained trade networks facilitated 73% of all interstellar commerce. Without them, galactic trade has dropped by more than half. The economic damage is approaching levels not seen since the collapse wars 4 centuries ago. Even more shocking was testimony from the minor species. Elder Tixik of the Quellan spoke passionately about how human protection had allowed his people to thrive, and how they now faced extinction without it. Representatives from a dozen other small civilizations shared similar stories. Director Zephron listened to it all, feeling the weight of his mistakes. Finally, he stood and addressed the council with complete honesty. We failed to see what humanity was doing for us because they did it so well. They prevented disasters before they happened. They resolved conflicts before they escalated. They protected the weak without demanding praise or recognition, and we repaid them with dismissiveness and contempt. He paused, looking around the chamber. I propose that we formally request humanity's return to the council, but not as they were before. We should return as a recognized major power, with full veto authority over council decisions. And we should implement the protections for minor species that they always advocated for. Not because humanity demands it, but because it is right. The vote was not immediate. Several major powers initially objected to giving humanity such authority. But the minor species, newly organized and vocal, made it clear that they would support only a council that included human leadership. And the major powers, faced with a galaxy falling apart around them, realized they had no real choice. The proposal passed with 84% support. The council formally invited humanity to return, accepting all of humanity's conditions. The only question now was whether humanity would accept. Whether they would forgive the galaxy for taking them for granted. Whether they would return to protect people who had not appreciated them the first time, in the viewing galleries, observers. from across the galaxy waited to see what would happen next. They had finally learned the truth about humanity's power. Not power measured in weapons or territory, but power measured in service and protection. In the countless quiet actions that held civilization together, the question was whether they had learned it in time. The message from the Galactic Council arrived at Earth through official diplomatic channels. President Catherine Moore read it 3 times, each word carefully chosen, each phrase a recognition of past mistakes. The Council was asking humanity to return. Not demanding, not assuming, asking. And they were offering everything that humanity had wanted during those frustrating 30 years of membership. Catherine convened her cabinet for what she knew would be a difficult discussion. The room was divided. Some argued that humanity should let the galaxy continue to suffer, that the lesson needed to be harsher and longer lasting. Others believed that while the Council deserved consequences, innocent people were dying every day, and humanity had a moral obligation to help. Commander Ryan Hughes attended the meeting. As a military advisor, when asked for his opinion, he stood and spoke with quiet conviction. I spent 10 years maintaining the Silent Shield network. I watched asteroids get deflected from collision courses with inhabited worlds. I helped contain plague outbreaks before they spread. I prevented wars by making sure the right intelligence reached the right people at the right time. I did not do any of that for gratitude or recognition. I did it because it was right. He paused, looking around the room. The other species were wrong to dismiss us. They were wrong to take us for granted. But walking away from people who need help, just to prove a point that goes against everything humanity stands for, we do not protect the weak because they appreciate us. We protect them because they need protection. His words resonated with many in the room. After hours of debate, President Moore made her decision. Humanity would return to the Council, but there would be conditions. The new agreement would be called the Guardian Compact. It would fundamentally change how the galactic government operated. Fleet Admiral Karen West received orders to prepare Operation Guardian's return. She stood on the bridge of the UNS Endeavour, the largest vessel in the human fleet, and reviewed the mission parameters. This would not be a simple diplomatic return. The galaxy was in chaos, and humanity would need to actively stabilize dozens of crisis situations. While re-establishing their presence, Karen was a woman who had spent 30 years in the military. Working her way up from ensign to fleet admiral through competence and dedication, she had commanded human forces during the Council years, often frustrated by the limitations placed on her by species who did not trust human military power. Now those same species were begging for that power to return. The irony was not lost on her. The human fleet that departed Earth was impressive. 60 warships, 40 support vessels, and 100 specialized craft designed for humanitarian aid, medical assistance, and infrastructure repair. It was the largest deployment of human forces in history, but Karen knew that weapons and ships were not going to solve the galaxy's problems. What would matter was whether humanity could rebuild the trust and cooperation that had been shattered. The first stop was the Crothan-Solarian war zone. The conflict had been raging for months, with neither side willing to back down. Billions of credits worth of ships had been destroyed. Thousands of crew members from both species had died, and the neutral systems caught between them were devastated. Their populations suffering under military occupation, Admiral West's flagship emerged from faster than light, traveled directly between the two fleets. The Crothans and Solarians had been preparing for another battle, but the sudden appearance of human vessels caught both sides off guard. Karen opened communications to both fleets simultaneously. This is Fleet Admiral Karen West of the United Earth Forces. Both fleets will stand down immediately and withdraw to neutral positions. Humanitarian vessels are en route to provide aid to occupied systems. A negotiating team will arrive within 6 hours to mediate a ceasefire agreement. Any vessel that fires weapons will be disabled. This is not a request. General Kraith, commanding the Crothan forces, felt his combat instincts warring with his common sense. The human fleet was not as large as his own, but he had studied human military capabilities extensively. Their technology was advanced, their tactics were innovative, and their crews were extraordinarily well trained. More importantly, he was tired. Tired of the war? Tired of the death? Tired of the responsibility for all the destruction? On the Solarian side, Commander Shirath felt similar emotions. The war had cost his people dearly, and there was no victory in sight. The arrival of the humans offered something he had not had in months. A way out that did not involve surrender or defeat. Both commanders ordered their fleets to stand down. The human vessels deployed a new technology, faster-than-light communications dampening. Field that prevented both fleets from receiving orders from their home governments. For the next 12 hours, the only voices the Crothans and Solarians would hear would be their own. The enemies and the human mediators. It was a forced timeout, technological way of making both sides actually talk instead of shoot. Captain Greg Martinez and his crew, who had been listening to distress calls for months, finally received the orders they had been waiting for. Reactivate the Silent Shield network and begin rescue operations for stranded civilian populations. Greg felt a surge of relief as his ship changed course toward the nearest failing sensor station. The work was extensive. Many of the stations had suffered damage from lack of maintenance. Others had been accidentally destroyed by ships that did not know they were there. But the core network was intact, and with human engineers working around the clock, the system began coming back online piece by piece. Lieutenant Amy Foster, monitoring communications from New Terra, watched as the distress calls began to change. Instead of desperate pleas for help that went unanswered, she heard human response teams acknowledging emergencies and dispatching aid. She heard pirate vessels retreating when human patrol ships appeared on their sensors. She heard the fear in people's voices being replaced by hope. Back in the war zone, Ambassador Daniel Hayes arrived to begin negotiations. He had not wanted to return to the council, still bitter about the years of dismissiveness and obstruction. But when President Moore had personally asked him to lead the diplomatic effort, he had agreed. Not for the council's sake, but for all the innocent people suffering from its failures. The negotiations were difficult. The Crothans wanted recognition that they had legitimate territorial claims. The Solarians wanted acknowledgement that the Crothans had been the aggressors. Both sides wanted the other to admit fault and pay reparations. It was the kind of deadlock that could last for years. Daniel listened to both sides for hours, letting them express their grievances and frustrations. Then he did something unexpected. He showed them casualty reports from the neutral systems, the minor species caught in their war. He showed them images of destroyed cities, refugee camps, children orphaned by the fighting. "You both believe you are right," Daniel said quietly. "You both have legitimate grievances. But while you argue about who started this and who owes what to whom, innocent people are dying. People who had nothing to do with your dispute, who just want to live their lives in peace." He leaned forward, his voice hardening. "Here is what is going to happen. You will both withdraw from the neutral systems immediately. You will both provide reparations to the affected populations. You will both accept a human-mediated border resolution. And you will both apologize, not to each other, but to the people whose lives you have destroyed with this pointless war." General Kraith bristled at being spoken to so directly. Commander Shirath ruffled his feathers in agitation. But both of them looked at the images Daniel had shown them, and both felt the weight of what they had done. The ceasefire agreement was signed within 8 hours, one of the fastest resolutions Daniel had ever achieved. While the diplomatic efforts continued, human medical ships began arriving at systems ravaged by war and piracy. The vessel Hope's Light, commanded by Dr. Helen Price, landed on a Quellan colony world that had been raided repeatedly over the past months. The tiny insectoid inhabitants had suffered greatly, their population reduced by disease and malnutrition. Helen and her team worked for days, treating the sick and injured without rest. They brought food, medicine, and supplies. But more than that, they brought something the Quellan had lost. They brought hope. Elder Tixik watched the human doctor's work and felt tears forming in his compound eyes. He had thought his people were doomed. Now, perhaps they had a chance. The Viridians faced their own reckoning. Captain Mevron, still struggling with occupation duty in the Halak system, received orders to withdraw. The Council had agreed to humanity's demand that exploitation of developing species would no longer be tolerated. The systems the Viridians had seized would be placed under neutral administration until the native populations were ready to govern themselves. Mevron felt a complicated mix of emotions as he prepared to leave. Relief that he would no longer have to deal with constant resistance and sabotage. Shame that his people had acted in ways that so clearly violated basic decency. In grudging respect for the humans, who had tried to tell them this was wrong all along, Director Zephron traveled to Earth Person, ally to formalize the new agreement. He met with President Moore in a ceremony broadcast across the galaxy. The symbolism was clear. The Council's highest leader coming to humanity, not the other way around. Asking for help rather than granting permission to return. On behalf of the Galactic Council, Zephron said formally, I apologize for our failure to recognize humanity's contributions and wisdom. We took for granted the work you did to keep our civilization stable and safe. We dismissed your concerns about protecting the vulnerable as naive idealism. We were wrong. We ask now that you return to the Council, not as petitioners, but as partners and leaders. Catherine accepted the apology with grace, but also with firmness. Humanity will return to the Council under the terms of the Guardian Compact. We will have full veto authority over Council decisions. Exploitation of developing species will be prohibited. Minor civilizations will have guaranteed representation and protection. And the Council will acknowledge that true power comes not from domination, but from service. The ceremony ended with both leaders signing the new agreement. Around the galaxy, billions of beings watched and understood that a new era was beginning. Ambassador Daniel Hayes returned to the Council chamber for the first time in months. The room looked the same, but everything had changed. The minor species now had guaranteed seats and voting rights. The major powers had accepted limitations on their authority. And at the center of it all, humanity had a place of honor and respect. Daniel stood at the human podium and looked around the chamber. He saw Crothan representatives who had once sneered at human idealism now listening attentively. He saw Viridians who had dismissed human warnings now eager to hear human counsel. He saw dozens of smaller species who finally had a voice in protection. Humanity returns to the Council with hope, Daniel began. Hope that we can build a galaxy where all species, regardless of size or strength, can thrive in peace. Where conflicts are resolved through dialogue rather than violence. Where the strong protect the weak instead of exploiting them. We did not do all the things we did for gratitude or recognition. We did them because they were right. And we will continue to do them, not because we are superior, but because we believe that civilization means taking care of each other. The chamber erupted in applause. Not the polite, obligatory applause of diplomatic ceremony, but genuine, heartfelt appreciation. The galaxy had learned its lesson. They had discovered that humanity's true power lay not in weapons or territory, but in the countless acts of service and protection that held civilization together as human ships spread out across the galaxy. Repairing infrastructure and rebuilding trust, the other species finally understood. They had not just underestimated humanity's capabilities. They had misunderstood the very nature of strength. Real power was not about forcing others to submit. It was about lifting others up. It was about protecting those who could not protect themselves. It was about building systems that helped everyone thrive. The galaxy would never forget this lesson, and humanity would never again be taken for granted. Together, they would build something better than what had come before, a civilization based not on dominance, but on cooperation, not on exploitation, but on mutual support, a galaxy where humans and aliens worked together, each bringing their strengths to create something greater than any could achieve alone. It would not be easy. There would be setbacks and challenges. But for the first time in a long time, the galaxy had hope. And hope, as humanity had shown, was the most powerful force in the universe.